This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We continue today with part 2 of our exclusive interview with one of 4 U.S. journalists who were detained in the Gulf state of Bahrain and released Sunday after an international outcry. Anna Therese Day and her camera crew were in Bahrain during protests marking the anniversary of the kingdom's February 2011 uprising. Bahraini authorities accused the group of falsely representing themselves as tourists and claimed one of them participated in an attack on the police. They were taken into custody and charged with illegal assembly with the intent to commit a crime. During their interrogation, they were initially denied an attorney and prevented from speaking with family members.
Human Rights First said the arrest of the journalist is part of a continuing crackdown on dissent in Bahrain. This comes as Human Rights First renews its call for the release of Bahraini opposition leader Ibrahim Sharif, who was sentenced to a year in jail just this past Wednesday for a 2015 speech in which he called for change. The Bahraini government has fought to suppress opposition protesters and journalists since the 2011 uprising that was crushed by martial law and U.S.-backed forces from Saudi Arabia entering Bahrain. Bahrain is a close ally of the U.S. It's home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which is responsible for all naval forces in the Gulf. We continue our conversation with Anna Therese Day, one of the journalists just released from detention in Bahrain. So if you can say to us what happened to you when, after your sound man was taken, how you and your other colleagues, your camera crew was taken, and then what happened to you in detention? What did the Bahraini authorities want to know?
After we were able to leave the neighborhood, which involved, going through a field, climbing a fence to even get out of these neighborhoods, we were on the highway at about 10 minutes from the neighborhood, and we were stopped at a checkpoint. We realize now that they knew exactly who they were looking for because all of these young activists had been tweeting our photos. So we were detained at a police station, held for 48 hours. We were moved around. I had 2 instances of mistreatment. The rest of our team were deprived food, water, medicine, and were prevented from calling our embassy, lawyers, and family.
It was you and how many others?
3 others, 3 of my
including
team.
The sound man?
Yes.
And were you kept together?
No, we were isolated so that we would, so they could interrogate us. They were hoping we would, turn on each other.
Were there, were you the only woman?
Yes, and I was isolated. I was treated differently than the men were, and I think that was because I was the producer on the shoot, and I had the names of our Bahraini contacts, and that was something we were very cooperative with the Bahraini police when we were first arrested. We were very forthcoming about being journalists and understanding that professionally we do know that we need to enter on tourist visas or journalist visas. We made that decision because we want to do a very important story that we still believe in. But we were cooperative. The tone of the entire interrogation switched gears at about 2 a.m. when they started asking us about our sources. They wanted us to reveal their names, identities. Of course, we would never do that as journalists, but more importantly, in a country like Bahrain, where children are being arrested and detained and disappeared, of course, we would have never revealed who we were working with inside these neighborhoods.
Well, Bahrain and the U.S. are very close allies. Could you talk about how the opposition in Bahrain views the U.S.?
What's so interesting about the Fifth Fleet is, they have about between 5,000 and 15,000 American forces on and off the island. So there's a huge American presence. And what I found most interesting in talking to the opposition is that even young activists understood that they felt the State Department is on their side and the Pentagon is against them. They felt that the State Department has done a lot to document human rights abuses, has done a lot to prevent or delay arms sales to repressive Bahraini authorities, but they feel that because of the Pentagon relationship and the Fifth Fleet, their rights are being compromised. One other thing that I would note is the opposition is actually incredibly moderate. Their demands are for reform, not even revolution. So they're asking for the right to vote, the end of discriminatory laws based on their ethnicities. So these are very moderate demands, and it's in fact the government that is quite radical in their crackdown. So that's what I find most interesting, and that many of the opposition were incredibly disappointed with the United States without being angry. They felt a lot of pride in having the Fifth Fleet there, and they didn't want necessarily to leave. They simply wanted the U.S. to use its influence for reform.
So back to this interrogation, you said the tone changed when you said you're not revealing sources. So what happened then?
I was isolated further from the men, and I was taken to a different police station. In fact, the police station where the protests had been clashing earlier in the day. At that point, again, I had been prevented from talking to the embassy, so no one knew where I was, and I knew no one knew where I was. And again, I was taken to a place that would be most frustrated by covering the protests. From there, I was interrogated. We're filing a complaint about the way I was interrogated, and then we were taken to a sentencing where the only way I was able to call the embassy was by essentially staging a fit. And we were then sentenced with charges that we didn't expect. They charged us with participation in unlawful protesting, rioting, the word terrorism was thrown around, and that sentences from 10 days to 2 years. And, you know, our Bahraini colleagues have life sentences for some of these things. In the interrogation, what did they know about you? What information did they have about you? Right away, they approached me with an op-ed that I wrote in 2012 about Nabeel Rajab, someone that you've had on Democracy Now! He's a human rights defender in Bahrain who was jailed for a tweet. His family continues to live under threat inside Bahrain. There's a travel ban, and when his wife is actually quite sick. So this is someone who I met in 2011, has faced an enormous amount of repression. I wrote an op-ed in his defense in 2012, and they immediately brought this up, and they said, we know you're a journalist and that you hate the government. Did they have emails of yours? We actually had emailed, funnily enough, in 2012, after I published that op-ed, they emailed both me and my editor at HuffPo calling me a liar direct from the Prime Minister's office. And they had that there. Yes, and well, they were very interested about how I got in, and we were interested how I got in either, because we expected my name to be on some list because of the previous reporting. So they were very suspicious that we not only got in, but got in with the camera gear that we had.
Well, in June 2014, we spoke with Nabeel Rajab, head of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. He joined us after having just been released from serving nearly 2 years behind bars for his role in pro-democracy protests. We asked him about the role of the U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and what kind of power the U.S. has in relation to the Bahraini monarchy.
The Navy plays a big role, the American Navy, more than the American State Department. And for them, priority is their presence, priority is their interest with Bahrain, priority is the arms sale and all that. So we've been ignored completely by American government and Western power. Very disappointing. And I always say, ignoring the struggle of people and supporting dictators that push people towards extremism. We've been abandoned by the American government. We've been ignored completely.
That was Nabeel Rajab speaking to Democracy Now! In June 2014. So, Anna, could you talk about what's happening with Nabeel now and how you've worked with him in the past?
Nabeel and other human rights defenders in Bahrain were very constructive in working with the government on reforms. But in fact, in November of 2015, a report came out that showed that the government has only implemented 2 of the 26 recommendations of this reform. Meanwhile, Nabeel's colleagues and journalists languish in prisons. Bahrain has one of the highest per capita prison rates in the world. So their prisons are filled with political prisoners right now whose rights have not been respected, even in terms of the reforms that the government promised. And Nabeel Rajab, again, raised in your interrogation. Yes. He's a very well-known human rights defender, and he was someone that we had hoped to meet with while in the country. We weren't able to because of our deportation, but he's someone who, you know, really is a tireless advocate. He has a travel ban and needs to leave the country for medical reasons for his wife, and he's being prevented from doing so.
What about Abdelhadi al-Khawaja, the whole al-Khawaja family that has been targeted, the daughters, Abdelhadi al-Khawaja, human rights activist who served as head of the human rights group before Nabil Rajab was, but then was arrested and has, what, a life sentence?
Yes, the Khawaja family has been under threat, specifically targeted for years now. I was actually first drawn to one of the stories in Bahrain by one of his daughters who she live-streamed a hunger strike. And I bring up the live stream because I think that's one of the most interesting things about the Bahraini opposition, how savvy they've been with social media and targeting the Western world, knowing that many in the United States have never heard of Bahrain, but that it is our government that has the power to really influence theirs. I met a young man in 2011 who his cousin had been tortured to death, and the body was released mangled. To have a body released in that condition, they really felt it was a sign to the protesters of what they would face in an arrest. When I met him, he said that they were targeting Oprah and Rihanna and other celebrities with, trending hashtags, and they were doing that because they saw how Obama 08's campaign used social media for social justice. So again, this is a population that's very moderate, hyper-educated, simply asking for reform, and really a population that wants to be part of the rest of the world.
So here you are, a U.S. journalist with your colleagues. You're detained, you're interrogated, you're held for 2 days. What role did the U.S. government play? I mean, they support the Bahraini regime. The U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet, as you've talked about, is there. What role did they play in what happened to you?
I think there's always going to be a tension between journalists and the State Department and the Pentagon about these media visas. In an ideal world, of course, we would all get the proper permits to work in these countries. But in countries that have gross repression of freedom of expression, we're not going to get the press pass and be able to do the stories that we need to tell. So while the embassy certainly mobilized, the ambassador spoke with my family and spoke with one of the princes of Bahrain. They certainly expedited our release. We were just down in D.C. yesterday. The State Department pulled every lever to get us out swiftly. And so, again,
Well, they certainly have their hands on the levers.
Absolutely. And I think that was what was most frustrating, even being
this isn't an enemy government. The U.S. works extremely closely with the Bahraini regime.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most frustrating parts of this story, that we keep on talking in terms of sacrificing human rights for national security when there are people at the State Department, even inside the Pentagon, who don't think we need to make that compromise. They actually believe that promotion of our democratic values is a long-term national security strategy. So to see how, there are great people inside government who, mobilized on our behalf and continue mobilized for the Bahraini people, but somehow they're being drowned out by this, maybe antiquated and counterproductive national security strategy.
And the relationship of another U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, and the role it plays in maintaining the oppression against the human rights activists?
Yes, a trope that's used against the opposition inside Bahrain often is that they're Iranian-backed, and that's based on an ethnic interpretation of, again, a popular movement for democratic reform. But when you talk to opposition, they say, when you ask them about foreign meddling, they always will say the only evidence of foreign meddling were Saudi troops that occupied our island. And that is factually correct and irrefutable.
Well, I want to turn to a clip of Bahrain's police chief, Brigadier General Tariq al-Hassan, speaking earlier this month.
Unfortunately, the issue of human rights has been misused by some organizations and by some states, and it has been politicized. If it were only about human rights, then they should acknowledge what Bahrain had achieved in this field. This talk of torture in prisons has no evidence today. It's not reality.
That's Bahrain's police chief. Anna, your response to what he said about the way in which organizations are distorting the issue of human rights.
Currently, there are about 200 children in prison. The police went to a girls' school where they took young girls who had been participant in protests, brought them out, asked them to identify their friends, and threatened them with rape. So this is not a country that has followed the reforms that they promised to the opposition movement and that they promised to the international community. So it's incredibly frustrating to hear them feel comfortable or satisfied with reforms when so many people are languishing in prison and fear for their lives.
So what are you planning to do with the footage you got with what happened to you in Bahrain? You're doing a documentary. What happens now since you were deported?
Well, we're delighted that we got the media out, and this is part of a series.
How did you get the media out, and what happened? Did they take any of your equipment?
They currently have over $20,000 worth of gear. It was also a virtual reality shoot, so they have really great cameras. We hope that they will cooperate and be professional and get them back to us. We don't really expect it, though.
What did they say? Why did they keep it? Why did they steal your equipment?
Our case is not closed, and then we expected it to be closed in 3 days because we think it's pretty straightforward. We can prove we're a journalist, and we can prove we're not participating in protests. But then they moved our gear to a criminal investigative unit, and that could take 3 months. So we don't expect to get it back.
How did you get your footage out?
I put the SDs inside me, and we got it out.
And so your plans now?
Well, this is part of a 6-part series on how U.S. foreign policy affects young people in the Middle East. We were in Gaza, Egypt, and Bahrain. We think that we're going to continue our coverage, and we think Bahrain is one of the most undercovered and important countries in the Middle East in terms of U.S. compromises.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Anna Therese Day, independent journalist, lived and reported in the Middle East for 5 years, focusing on how U.S. foreign policy affects young people in the region. She was just deported from Bahrain with her camera crew. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.